My brother took everything in childhood, and now he's claimed the family inheritance, pushing our rivalry to the breaking point. It started with a phone call. A simple, harmless phone call that I thought would be nothing more than a routine conversation with my parents. But this time, something felt off from the moment I answered. My father's voice was unusually curt, and my mother's was distant, almost cold. I had no idea that this call would be the beginning of one of the worst fights our family had ever faced. "Hey, Dad," I said, trying to sound casual, hoping to ease the tension I could already sense. "What's up?" He didn't respond right away, and when he finally spoke, his tone was clipped. "We need to talk about the money. You know what I'm referring to." I froze, unsure of what he meant. "The money? What money?" "The money your mother and I have been setting aside for years," he replied sharply. "The savings. For the future." I had a vague idea of what he was referring to, an account they had mentioned here and there over the years, but nothing I had paid much attention to. "Okay, what about it?" My father's voice hardened. "We've decided that it's time to start thinking about how to divide it. Your brother's already brought it up, and we think he has a point." I could feel the ground shifting beneath me. "Wait, divide it? What do you mean?" I didn't even know this was a conversation we were having. "We've been having this conversation for a while," he said, sounding frustrated. "But you haven't been around to hear it." That last sentence hit like a punch to the gut. I had always been the one to stay out of the family's financial discussions, preferring to let my parents handle things the way they saw fit. But now, it seemed like that decision was coming back to haunt me. "I didn't know it was an issue," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But if this is about inheritance, I think we need to discuss it as a family." My mother chimed in, her voice much softer but no less firm. "Your brother feels like he's been more involved in helping us manage things. He's been here for us when we needed him. We're not saying you haven't, but..." I cut her off, anger starting to bubble up. "But what? You think I haven't been there for you? You think I don't care?" "No one's saying that," my father interjected, but his tone suggested otherwise. "What we're saying is, your brother has been shouldering more of the burden. We think it's fair to recognize that." "Recognize it how?" I asked, the frustration clear in my voice now. There was a pause, and then my father spoke again, this time more quietly. "We're thinking about giving him a larger share. It's only fair, considering everything." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My brother, the golden child, had always managed to be at the right place at the right time. I had my own life, my own responsibilities, but somehow, that was never enough. And now, they were planning to give him more of the inheritance because of it? "That's not fair," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You can't just decide something like that without talking to me." "We're talking to you now," my father said, his tone sharp. "But the decision has already been made. We're just letting you know." I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. "So that's it? You're just cutting me out?" "No one's cutting you out," my mother said quickly. "But we have to be realistic. Your brother has been more involved, and we think it's only right to take that into account." My anger flared. "This is about money, isn't it? It's always about money with him. He's manipulated you into giving him more." "Watch your tone," my father snapped. "This isn't about manipulation. It's about fairness." "Fairness?" I laughed bitterly. "You're giving him more because he's been around more? What about all the times I've helped? What about everything I've done for this family?" "We're not having this conversation again," my father said, his voice final. "The decision is made." I stood there in stunned silence, my hands shaking with rage. My own family, the people I thought I could always rely on, were siding with my brother over money. And it felt like there was nothing I could do to stop it. "This isn't over," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're going to regret this." I hung up before they could respond, the weight of the fight crashing down on me. This wasn't just about money. It was about something much deeper, about loyalty, about family, about who really mattered. And I wasn't going to let them forget that. The days following that call were some of the hardest I'd ever experienced. I tried to focus on my work, my friends, anything to distract myself from the growing anger festering inside me. But every time my phone buzzed or I saw my brother's name pop up in a family group chat, I felt that familiar surge of frustration. I didn't reach out to my parents. I wasn't ready to talk to them after the way they'd blindsided me. As far as I was concerned, they could live with the choice they made. And as for my brother, Jake, well, he could have whatever he wanted. He always did, didn't he? A few days later, my phone rang. I ignored it at first, but when it buzzed again with the same caller ID, my mother, I reluctantly answered. "Hey, Mom," I said, trying to sound neutral, but I could already hear the tension in my own voice. "Hi, sweetheart," she replied, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "I haven't heard from you in a few days. I wanted to check in." I stayed silent for a moment, biting back the flood of angry words I wanted to say. "I've been busy," I finally replied, keeping my tone cool. She sighed. "I know that phone call was upsetting for you, but your father and I don't want to talk about it," I interrupted, my voice harsher than I intended. "You've made your decision. What's the point?" "We haven't made any final decisions," she said, her tone now defensive. "We're still figuring things out. We just wanted to keep you informed." "Right," I said, the sarcasm slipping out before I could stop it. "Informed after you already decided Jake deserves more. Real fair, Mom." She hesitated, and for a moment, I thought I heard guilt in her voice. "It's not about deserving more, it's about what's best for everyone." "Everyone except me," I shot back. "That's not true," she said quickly. "We love you both, but your brother has been here more often. He's been helping out. We have to take that into account." The anger bubbled up again. "So what, now loyalty has a price tag? I didn't realize that every visit with you two was part of some competition for who could win the biggest share of the inheritance." "That's not what I meant," she said, exasperated. "Please, can't we talk about this calmly?" I sighed, feeling the familiar pang of guilt mix with my frustration. "I don't know what you want me to say, Mom. You made me feel like I don't matter as much because I wasn't around as much. I've always tried to be there when it counted, but Jake, he's always managed to be the one in the spotlight. And now you're rewarding him for it." "That's not true," she said quietly. "We don't see it that way. We've always loved you equally." I felt my anger start to wane, replaced by a deep sadness. "It doesn't feel that way, Mom. It never has." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before my mother spoke again. "I'm sorry you feel that way. I really am. Maybe we need to sit down together, as a family, and talk about this. I don't want this to come between us." I bit my lip, trying to keep my emotions in check. I don't know if talking is going to change anything. I just feel like I'm always in second place. And it hurts. "We'll figure it out," she promised, though her voice sounded uncertain. "We'll fix this." Later that evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, I found myself replaying the conversation over and over in my head. My mother's words had softened some of my anger, but the sense of betrayal was still there. It wasn't just about the money. It was about what it represented, the years of feeling overshadowed by Jake, the years of being the one who always had to fight to be heard. And as much as I wanted to believe my mother's promise, I couldn't shake the feeling that the damage had already been done. A few days later, I got another call. This time, it was Jake. I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to hear whatever excuse he had for why he deserved more than me, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice flat. "Hey," Jake replied, his tone surprisingly casual. "Mom said you're upset about the whole money thing." I rolled my eyes. Understatement of the year. "Look, I get it," he said, his voice smooth, too smooth. "But you've got to understand where I'm coming from. I've been helping them out for years now, dealing with all the little things, the financial stuff, everything. You know how it is." I clenched my jaw. "Yeah, I know exactly how it is. You swoop in, act like the hero, and now you get a bigger slice of the pie. How convenient for you." He sighed, the sound of fake patience. "It's not like that. This isn't some competition, and I'm not trying to screw you over. I just think it's fair, considering all I've done." I felt a surge of anger. "Fair? You think it's fair to be rewarded for being around more, while I've been busting my ass living my life? I've always been there for them when they needed me, but now you get more because you've been dealing with their finances? This is insane." "Come on, don't make it personal," Jake said, clearly getting frustrated. "It's just the way things worked out." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You've always managed to work things out in your favor, haven't you? Ever since we were kids." There was a long pause, and when Jake spoke again, his voice was cold. "If you want to make this a fight, fine. But don't say I didn't try to keep things civil." And with that, he hung up. I sat there for a long time after the call ended, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. This wasn't just a fight over money. It was the culmination of years of tension, of unspoken resentment between me and Jake. And now, it was threatening to tear the family apart. But if Jake thought he could bully me into backing down, he was dead wrong. I wasn't going to let him, or anyone else, take what was rightfully mine. This fight was just getting started. After my call with Jake, I knew there was no going back. The fracture in the family was deepening, and the worst part was that it wasn't just between me and my brother anymore. The tension had spread to my parents, and it seemed like everyone was walking on eggshells. Every family text thread felt forced, with polite words that barely concealed the mounting resentment. I wasn't going to let this go. If Jake wanted to play hardball, I was ready. A few weeks later, my parents suggested we all meet at their house to talk things through. It felt more like a family intervention than a peaceful conversation. I arrived late on purpose, steeling myself for the confrontation that was coming. When I walked into the living room, I could feel the thick silence. My parents sat on one side of the room, looking tired and worn down, while Jake sat across from them, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. No one said a word as I took a seat. "So," I said, breaking the silence. "Let's talk." My father cleared his throat and started cautiously, "We've given it a lot of thought, and we don't want this to become something that tears the family apart." "It's already doing that," I shot back, folding my arms. "This whole thing is a mess." "We know," my mother said softly, looking at me with sad eyes. "That's why we're here. We want to work through this together." I glanced at Jake, who was staring at me with that same smug look he always had when he knew he had the upper hand. I could feel my blood start to boil. Work through it? How? By giving Jake what he wants and telling me to accept it? "That's not what we're saying," my father replied, his voice firm. "We're trying to be fair, but we also have to consider what's best for the family." "There's nothing fair about this," I said, shaking my head. "Jake's been manipulating you both for years, acting like he's the one keeping everything together. But where's the recognition for all the things I've done? For all the times I've been there for you when it really mattered?" Jake scoffed, finally speaking up. "Oh, come on, don't act like you've been some kind of saint. You've been off doing your own thing for years, barely checking in. Meanwhile, I've been the one actually handling things. You just don't want to admit that." I could feel my fists clench. "I've been living my life, Jake. Not everything revolves around hanging out with mom and dad every weekend to prove a point. And just because you've been around more doesn't mean you deserve more." "This isn't about deserving more," Jake said, his voice rising. "It's about who's been taking care of them, who's been stepping up. You wouldn't know what that's like." The room went quiet, and I could see the hurt flash across my parents' faces. That was the problem, wasn't it? Jake had them convinced that he was the good son, the one who had made sacrifices for them, while I had somehow become the selfish one. "I'm not asking for more," I said, my voice low but firm. "I'm asking for what's fair. We're family. This shouldn't be about who deserves more or who's done more. It should be about what's right." My mother sighed deeply, running her hands over her face. "We've been trying to figure out what's right for everyone. This isn't easy for us either." Jake's patience was clearly running thin. "Look, I'm done going around in circles. I've been there for them more, I've been helping out, and I've earned their trust. This is how it is, whether you like it or not." I shot to my feet, the anger finally boiling over. "This isn't about trust, Jake. This is about you wanting to take more than your share, just like you always have. You've been pulling this crap since we were kids, taking what you wanted and leaving me with the scraps. I'm not letting it happen again." "Stop," my father's voice cut through the tension, loud and commanding. He stood up, looking at both of us with the sternness I hadn't seen in years. "Enough of this. We're not doing this today." My mother looked like she was about to cry. "Please," she said quietly, "we don't want to lose either of you over something like this." Jake and I both stood there, glaring at each other, the years of resentment bubbling just beneath the surface. But the sight of my mother, her eyes filled with tears, brought the fight down a notch. I hadn't realized just how much this was tearing them apart too. "We're family," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to act like it." I swallowed hard, my anger slowly ebbing away as guilt started to settle in. As much as I hated what Jake was doing, I hated even more that it was hurting them. "I don't want to fight anymore," I said, my voice softer now. "But I'm not going to sit here and be pushed aside." "We're not pushing you aside," my father said, calmer now. "We've made mistakes in how we've handled this, but we're willing to fix it, if both of you are willing to work with us." I glanced at Jake, who had gone quiet, his face unreadable again. After a long pause, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Fine," he muttered. "I don't want to fight either. But this whole thing, it's complicated." "I know it is," my mother said. "But we can figure it out together." There was a long, tense silence, but the fight seemed to have drained out of all of us. I knew this wasn't the end of the conflict, but for now, it felt like a truce, fragile and uncertain, but a truce nonetheless. We sat down again, and though the tension still hung in the air, we started talking. About the money, about the inheritance, about everything that had been festering between us for years. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were actually being honest with each other. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But maybe, just maybe, we could find a way through it together. The uneasy truce we'd established at the last family meeting held up for a while, but it was fragile, like walking on a glass floor, knowing it could shatter beneath us at any moment. Conversations with my parents became more tentative, as if they were afraid to say the wrong thing and send me or Jake spiraling into another argument. Jake and I avoided each other. The polite exchanges were just that, polite. There was no brotherly warmth, no joking or shared memories. I wasn't sure if we'd ever get that back. A few weeks after the big confrontation, my parents decided to bring in an estate planner to mediate the inheritance discussions. They wanted to ensure everything was fair, and they were hopeful that having a neutral third party would keep things from escalating again. It seemed like the right move, on paper, at least. We all met at my parents' house again, this time with a lawyer named Mr. Clarkson. He was a sharp-looking man in his late 50s, with a no-nonsense demeanor. His job was to help us divide the estate fairly and prevent any further fights. I'll admit, part of me thought this was just delaying the inevitable. No lawyer could solve what was really going on between me and Jake. But at this point, I was willing to try anything to avoid another blowout. We sat around the same living room that had witnessed our previous battle, though this time there was a strange calm in the air. My parents looked relieved to have someone else guiding the conversation. Jake, as usual, seemed distant but composed. "Thank you all for being here," Mr. Clarkson began, his voice formal but steady. "The goal today is to go over the family estate and come to a mutual agreement that satisfies everyone involved." I glanced at my parents. They were sitting together on the couch, holding hands like they were bracing for impact. It was clear that this whole ordeal had taken a toll on them. Mr. Clarkson went on to explain the various assets my parents had, the house, some investments, a few savings accounts. Nothing extravagant, but it was enough to matter. Enough to fight over, apparently. "As your parents have made clear," Clarkson continued, "they want to ensure that both of you receive what's fair, taking into account not just financial contributions, but also the roles you've both played in supporting the family." I could feel the tension rising again. That phrase, "the roles you've both played," hit a nerve. It was exactly what Jake had been using to justify getting a bigger share. I tried to keep my cool as Mr. Clarkson continued. "We'll begin by discussing the house," Clarkson said. "Your parents wanted to remain in the family, but they also recognize that you both have different lives now. Selling the house and splitting the proceeds is one option, or one of you could buy out the other's share." The thought of selling the house made my stomach churn. This was where we'd grown up, where we'd celebrated birthdays, holidays, everything. The idea of letting it go felt like losing something much bigger than bricks and mortar. "I'd be interested in buying it," Jake said, cutting through my thoughts. His tone was matter-of-fact, as if it had already been decided. I shot him a look. "What? You're just going to take the house too?" Jake turned to me, his expression calm but sharp. "I'm not taking it. I'm offering to buy your share. It's a reasonable solution." A reasonable solution for him, maybe. He'd stay in the house, while I'd get a check and a lifetime of resentment. And what if I want the house? I asked, knowing full well I didn't have the money to compete with him on this. "You've never said you wanted it," Jake replied, his voice tinged with impatience. "You've moved on, got your own place. I've been here more. It makes sense." There it was again, the same argument, dressed up in legal terms this time. Jake had earned it by being around. My parents looked uncomfortable, but they didn't jump in to stop the discussion. Mr. Clarkson stayed neutral, his eyes flicking between us. "If both of you are interested in the property, we can discuss options for dividing it fairly. Perhaps shared ownership, though that can be complicated." "Shared ownership?" Jake snorted. "That's not practical." I couldn't take it anymore. "Of course, it's not practical for you. You've always been the one to take what you want and leave me with nothing. This is no different." Jake's eyes narrowed. "That's not what this is about, and you know it. I've been the one dealing with the upkeep of this place, helping Mom and Dad out, handling the bills." "Oh, spare me the martyr act, Jake," I interrupted, my voice rising. "You're just making sure you come out on top, like always." "Stop it." My mother's voice, trembling but firm, cut through our argument. "This isn't helping." There was a long, heavy silence. My father sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to will away the tension. "I can't stand this," my mother said quietly. "Watching you two tear each other apart over money, over this house. It's not worth it." The guilt hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew she was right. The house, the inheritance, it was tearing us apart. But I didn't know how to back down without feeling like I was giving in, without feeling like I was losing something I could never get back. Mr. Clarkson spoke up again, his tone carefully neutral. "There are other options. If neither of you can agree on the house, it may be best to sell and split the proceeds evenly." I could feel my heart pounding. Selling the house? The idea of it leaving the family made me feel sick, but what choice did I have? "I don't want to sell," I said softly. "But I also don't want to lose it to Jake." Jake looked at me, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he sighed, his voice softer than before. "I don't want to lose it either. But I'm not trying to push you out. This place means something to both of us." His words caught me off guard. For the first time, I saw a glimpse of the brother I used to know, the one I'd shared so much with in this very house. "I just don't want to feel like I'm always the one getting less," I admitted, my voice quieter now, more vulnerable than I wanted it to be. Jake didn't respond right away, but when he did, his tone had softened. "I get that. But we've both given up a lot in different ways. Maybe we can figure out a way to make this work without destroying everything." The tension in the room seemed to ease, just a little. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like maybe we weren't on the verge of another fight. My parents exchanged a hopeful look. Mr. Clarkson nodded and started talking about potential compromises, but I wasn't really listening. For now, it felt like a small victory just to be sitting here, talking about something other than winning or losing. The storm hadn't passed yet, but at least we weren't adding fuel to the fire. Weeks passed after our meeting with Mr. Clarkson, and surprisingly, things between Jake and me didn't implode again. We weren't exactly friendly, but we had moved past the raw hostility that had defined our last few months. The issue of the house and inheritance still loomed large, but for once, it didn't feel like the center of every conversation. Maybe it was the realization that no matter what happened, we were family, and tearing each other apart over money wasn't worth it. Mr. Clarkson had given us a few options to consider, and though Jake and I hadn't settled on anything definitive yet, we were actually communicating. That in itself felt like a victory. My parents, who had seemed so fragile and worn down by our fighting, looked relieved every time we spoke without raising our voices. It was a small piece, but it was something. One evening, after what felt like months of uncertainty, my mother called me over for dinner. She hadn't mentioned anything specific, just that she and Dad wanted to talk. I assumed it was more of the same, trying to smooth things over between me and Jake, or maybe nudging us toward a decision. I was exhausted by it all, but I went anyway. When I arrived, Jake was already there, which wasn't unusual. He'd been spending more time with them, something that used to irritate me, but now I found I didn't care as much. We all sat around the dinner table, and for a moment, it felt like old times. The tension had lightened, and even though we weren't back to normal, there was a quiet understanding between us now. After dinner, my father cleared his throat, which usually meant he had something important to say. "We've been thinking a lot about everything," he began, glancing at my mother, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Your mother and we've made a decision about the house and the inheritance." I felt my stomach tighten. Here it was, the final word. I braced myself, not sure what to expect. Would they give it all to Jake, as I'd feared? Or would they try to split things evenly, and somehow end up making everyone unhappy? But what my father said next took me by surprise. "We're not selling the house," he said firmly. "We want it to stay in the family, but we also know that both of you have your own lives, and it wouldn't be fair to expect either of you to carry the full responsibility." I glanced at Jake, who looked just as confused as I felt. "What do you mean?" Jake asked, his voice cautious. My mother smiled softly. "We've decided to keep the house in our names, but we're setting it up in a trust. That way, neither of you has to fight over it. The house will belong to both of you equally, but neither of you can sell it or make changes without the other's agreement." It took a moment for the idea to sink in. They were effectively taking the house off the table as a point of contention. Neither of us could claim it as our own, but neither of us would lose it either. It was an odd sort of compromise, but it made sense. The house would stay in the family, just as they wanted, and Jake and I wouldn't be able to fight over it anymore. "And the inheritance?" I asked, still trying to process everything. My father nodded. "We've adjusted things so that it's fair. The financial assets will be split evenly between the two of you. No more, no less." Jake didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, staring at the table, his expression unreadable. I half expected him to argue, to push back on the decision like he had so many times before. But then, to my surprise, he nodded. "That sounds fair," Jake said quietly. "It's not exactly what I was expecting, but I think it's the right decision." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Jake, agreeing to something that didn't give him the upper hand? It felt like a weight had lifted off my shoulders. For the first time, it seemed like we were on the same page. "I agree," I said, my voice soft but firm. "It's fair." My parents looked relieved, like a great burden had finally been lifted from their hearts. My mother wiped away a tear, smiling through it. "I'm just so happy to see you two not fighting anymore. That's all we ever wanted." It hit me then how much this whole ordeal had weighed on them, maybe even more than it had on Jake or me. They didn't care about the money or the house, they just wanted their family back. And while things between me and Jake were far from perfect, it felt like we were finally moving in the right direction. As the night went on, we talked about memories of the house, Christmases, birthdays, and random little moments that had stuck with us. It was the first time in a long time that the conversation wasn't tinged with resentment or bitterness. For once, it felt like we were just a family again. When it was time to leave, Jake pulled me aside. It was the first time we'd spoken one-on-one without a mediator or a fight looming over us. "Hey," he said awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know things have been rough between us, and I haven't made it easy. I guess. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." I blinked, not sure what to say. Jake wasn't the type to apologize, especially not to me. "I've been holding on to a lot of stuff from when we were kids," he continued. "I thought being the responsible one gave me some kind of right to more. But I see now that it's not about that. I don't want to lose you over this." For a long moment, I just stood there, processing his words. It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. "I'm sorry too," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "I've been holding on to stuff too. I don't want to fight anymore, Jake. We're brothers. We should be able to figure this out without tearing each other apart." Jake nodded, and for the first time in what felt like forever, we shared a genuine moment of understanding. We weren't magically fixed, and I knew there would still be bumps in the road ahead. But for the first time, it felt like we were on the same side, working toward something better. The house, the inheritance, none of it seemed as important anymore. What mattered was that we were finally starting to rebuild what we'd lost. As I drove home that night, I realized that the inheritance wasn't the thing that had been dividing us. It was just a symptom of deeper wounds, old rivalries, and unspoken grievances. But now, maybe we could start healing those wounds, piece by piece. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future, about our family.